Greetings, everyone. Nothing has changed. I'm still Marlene, greeting you from Tallinn, Estonia, Praxis, and this is EUROSTUDENT Talks. I'm very happy to have you here. And as you saw from the advertisements and from the invitation, today we are talking about student funding by different welfare state principles. There are actually very many intriguing questions that we are trying to answer today. For example, what results do countries achieve when they follow one or another of the welfare state principles? Which system is so-called better for students or for the society, and so on. And of course, I'm also kind of reminding you that we will be recording the event. And actually, today we have one special request for you as well. In the chat, you can see a link to EUROSTUDENT Talks feedback form. And it's not connected only to today's webinar, but to the whole webinar series. And we would be very happy to receive your feedback to EUROSTUDENT Talks and your ideas, what could be improved in the future. So please save the link for later or open it in the background and after the webinar. I really hope that you can share your ideas as well. And today we have here Christoph Kvosch from German Center for Higher Education Research and Science Studies. And Christoph will do today's presentation. So just a couple of words about Christoph. Christoph is an economist and senior researcher. He started working for the German Center for Higher Education Research and Science Studies in 2007. Since 2009, he has been working on the EUROSTUDENT project. And currently he and Hendrik Schirmer are actually leading the whole project while Christina Hauschild is on a maternal leave. So we can definitely say that Christoph is the EUROSTUDENT person behind it. And Christoph works also on international and other international and national projects on the topics of student and university funding, as well as student mobility. And I won't make it longer. I think it's time for the presentation. And so, hello, Christoph, and it's time for your presentation. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Marlene, for the kind introduction. I just try to share my screen. And I hope it works. Can you see this in the presentation mode?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, today's topic is, as Marlene already mentioned, student funding by different welfare state principles, an empirical system comparison. And I think if you have any questions of understanding during the presentation, please pose right away your questions because it's important that the theoretical frame and the empirical data are understood. But if you may think, I'm not really in line with his interpretations of the theory or the empirical data, then maybe we can postpone this to the end of the presentation and start a discussion afterwards. That would be nice. Okay, what's on the agenda today? The basic research question that I'm interested in is how do countries actually perform if their public student support systems follow different welfare state principles. And you can deduce further research questions from that. And the theoretical frame I'm using is the theory of social policy. My data source is, of course, EUROSTUDENT, and namely the EUROSTUDENT 7 data set. And I will use aggregate data. And I will compare two country groups with each other. The first group encompasses Austria, Switzerland, Germany, Lithuania, and Poland. And the second group has Finland, Luxembourg, Malta, Norway, and Sweden. And from this, you can already tell that my abilities to analyze the data are quite limited because I use aggregate data and small country groups. That means the friends of statistics might be a bit disappointed because any differences in results cannot be tested for significance. But nevertheless, I think there are some interesting results, and I consider this analysis as a starting point for further in-depth analysis. I will use several indicators. That is the share of recipients of public support as share of recipients' total income, the composition of public student support, and these are descriptive indicators. And the last two indicators, the extent of students' financial difficulties, as well as proportional social representation at higher education institutions. They are descriptive indicators as well, but they can also be considered as success indicators. Okay, let's start with this theoretical frame, the theory of social policy. This theory, among others, explains and uses different basic principles that can be used to design a social security system. And these fundamental principles are the welfare principle, the supply principle, and the insurance principle. The welfare principle is used to level out insufficient income or assets of individuals that otherwise don't allow to secure either a physical or cultural subsistence level. And public support, which is designed according to this principle, is geared usually towards rather small groups of a population. And examples of public measures according to the welfare principle are, for instance, social aid and housing benefit. The supply principle is somewhat different. One reason for applying the supply principle is that public support is used to compensate for a special performance or sacrifice that certain population groups have provided for society. Examples from Germany, for instance, are the groups of civil servants or victims of the Second World War who receive public provisions based on the supply principle. Another reason for using the supply principle, however, can be that public support is used to compensate for a general disadvantage. And that is actually the main reasoning for public student support, which is based on the supply principle. That students, for instance, have to spend time on their studies, and this puts them at a disadvantage compared to other persons who can work full-time. And this disadvantage is supposed to be equalized by the public sector. The insurance principle refers to statutory social insurance and not to private insurance. And therefore, the insurance principle differs clearly from private insurance. For instance, in the sense that statutory social insurance is compulsory and not voluntary. It is usually restricted to certain social groups. And the individual contribution that is paid to the insurance is based on social criteria and not on the equivalence principle. And public support is often independent of the payment of contributions. So that's again a proof that the equivalence principle does not hold. Now these three principles can all be used to design a social security system. And for instance, in Germany, all three principles are at work. For instance, as I said, the welfare principle is used for housing benefit, the supply principle for provisions to civil servants, and the insurance principle is used widely with respect to unemployment insurance, health insurance, long-term care insurance, and so on. Now, the three principles can also be used to design a public student support system. And in fact, this is the case in many countries. And for instance, in Germany, the welfare principle is widely used, not only for housing benefits to students, but also for designing the so-called BAföG, that is the main instrument of public student support in Germany. The insurance principle is, for instance, used if students receive cost-free or cost-reduced statutory health insurance or long-term care insurance. Or for instance, students can receive orphans pension from statutory pension insurance or accident insurance. And international comparison have shown that the public support that is based on the insurance principle is quite widespread in Germany. So a lot of support that is going to students is based on this principle. But nevertheless, it shows that in practice, there is no public student support system which is using dominantly the insurance principle. And that means that it's either the welfare principle or the supply principle that is used to design public student support systems. And that is the reason why I concentrate in the following only on these two principles. And let's take a look at the basic features of the two principles. The welfare principle is based on the criterion of special individual neediness, on subsidiarity, and the covering of individual demand. What does that mean? Individual neediness means that a student has to prove that he or she is in need of public support. And usually the student then must report his income and assets to the public authority that is granting public support. Subsidiarity means that the state only ties in if the private sector has used up all means within certain legal boundaries. And that means, for instance, that students' parents may be obliged to pay maintenance. And in this case, if the student applies for public support, then the student's parents must report their income to the public institution or authority as well. And if the student is married, for instance, then the same applies to the student's spouse. The spouse needs to report his income and assets as well. Covering individual demand means that there may be different criteria which are used to calculate public support for a student. And these criteria can be, for instance, the student's housing form. That means, is the student living in the parental home or away from parents? And if he's living away from parents, then he's most likely paying rent, and that is a criterion that can be taken into account for calculating public support. Other criteria are, for instance, the existence of children, the student's health condition, or the payment of social insurance contribution. In Germany, for instance, students may have to pay under certain conditions contributions to statutory health insurance and long-term care insurance. And this will be taken into account for calculating public support. The situation is different under the supply principle. There, the special individual neediness is replaced by a general neediness. And that means the person-related eligibility criteria are less demanding compared to the welfare principle. For instance, while under the welfare principle, the student needs to report his income and assets, under the supply principle, it might be sufficient that the student proves that he's enrolled in higher education. And under the supply principle, the subsidiarity is missing. That means, for instance, students are considered being financially independent of their parents. And then that's parents' income and wealth doesn't matter for calculating student public support. And under the supply principle, the benefits are rather uniform. That means there are less or no individual characteristics that are taken into account for calculating public student support. Now, the two principles can also be mixed to some extent when designing a public student support system. For instance, in Denmark, public grants are available for all Danish full-time students. And that's actually a feature of the supply principle. But for instance, if students are living with their parents, then the parental income is taken into account for calculating the students' public support. And that's actually a characteristic of the welfare principle. So the two principles can be mixed to some extent, but there will be always a principle that is dominating, either the welfare principle or the supply principle. Now, the European higher education area is also referring to the principles that I just introduced, but the reference is actually only implicit. So, for instance, in the Annex 2 to the Rome Communique, it is stated that financial support systems should aim to be universally applicable to all students. However, when this is not possible, the public student financial support systems should be primarily needs-based and should make higher education affordable for all students, foster access to, and provide opportunities for success in higher education. So this can be interpreted as a first preference of the European higher education area, or to be more precise, of the governments of the countries forming part of the European higher education area. A first preference regarding the supply principle, because public support should aim to be universally applicable to all students. And that's a clear feature of the supply principle. And there's a second preference for the welfare principle, when it is stated that public students' financial support system should be primarily needs-based, because that is a clear characteristic of the welfare principle. Okay, now let's take a look at the empirical results. This is a system comparison of the share of recipients of national public student support, which is on the horizontal axis, and public support as share of the recipient's total monthly income, which is measured on the vertical axis. Now, on the left-hand side, we have countries that apply the welfare principle, that is Austria, Switzerland, Germany, Poland, and Lithuania. And on the right-hand side, we have countries applying the supply principle, that is Malta, Luxembourg, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. And we can see that, for instance, as far as the share of recipients of national public student support is concerned, in the first group of countries, the share is ranging from 9% in Switzerland to 31% in Lithuania. And in the other country group, the range is from 50% in Malta to 77% in Sweden. So clearly higher shares for the second group. And if we take a look at the other variable, that is the share of public support and the recipient's monthly income, then for the first group of countries, the share is ranging from 22% in Lithuania to 50% in Poland and Germany. And in the other group, the percentages range from 33% in Malta to 78% in Sweden. And the difference between the two groups become even more apparent when we take a look at cross-country averages. So this is the international averages, and we can see that across the countries applying the welfare principle, on average, 20% of all students receive public support, while the share for the other group is more than 3 times as high. So that's quite a difference between the two systems. And if we take a look at the income share, public support as share of total income, then it's 42% for the first group and 53% for the second group. So clear difference as well. And I think these are results that could be expected because it's in the logic of the system that the supply principle is geared towards large groups of the population, in this case, the student population, while the welfare principle is geared at rather small groups. So this is a difference that can basically be expected, but it's nice to have it quantified because the difference is quite large. And it could also be expected, I think, that the share of public support in the recipient's income is higher for the second group, because we have to take into account that the obligation for paying maintenance is either not existent or less pronounced for parents under the supply principle. And therefore, the public sector has to step into the breach and has to take over the shares that are paid by the students' parents, which is different under the welfare principle. Okay, now the next indicator, which is actually related to public support and the extent or significance of public support is the composition of public support. And here, all public support that is going to students has been differentiated by two criteria, and that is non-repayable support, which encompasses grants and scholarships, and on the other hand, repayable support, which means loans that are either interest-bearing or not interest-bearing. And here you can see that, for instance, repayable support is playing a clearly different role in the two groups of countries. The share of repayable support is less pronounced under the welfare principle, and it's reaching from 0% in Austria. Austria is relying completely on non-repayable support, to 51% in Germany. And if we take a look at the other group, then we'll see that the share of repayable support is ranging from 7% in Luxembourg to 98% in Norway. And if we take a look at the international average, then we see that the share of repayable support is 26% across all countries on the left-hand side, and the share for the countries applying the supply principle is more than twice as high. So that's quite a difference as well. And this has also a meaning for the burden sharing. So in the country group with the welfare principle, the burden of financing higher education, or at least for financing students, is rather lying with the whole society, because the student receive mainly non-repayable support in the form of grants and scholarships. And that means society is paying the financial burden via taxes. And that's different in the other group of countries with the supply principle. There, the share of repayable support is clearly higher, on average across countries, 58%. And that means the burden of financing students is mainly lying with the students, and with a certain time lag, it's the students who have to repay the loans and maybe also interest. Talking about interest, I tried to figure out what the interest rate for educational loans is in the different countries, and that's quite difficult. I took a look at OECD reports, Education at a Glance, and also EUROSTUDENT reports, and you find little information that is internationally comparable on the interest rate for educational loans. But for instance, the OECD report for the study year 2015-2016 states that the interest rates in Germany is 0%. That is because the loan part of BAföG, the main instrument for public student support, is interest-free. And the same goes for educational loans in Finland, in Norway, and in Sweden, the interest rate is 0.6%. So the interest rate is rather low, but that changes over time. For instance, not so long ago in Norway, it was the case that for educational loans, there was an interest rate based on government bonds with a runtime of 3 months. plus 1% for administrative costs. So that means in Norway, the interest rate for educational loans was even above the market level. And if you have ever taken out a loan that is subject to interest, then you know that a really high burden of a loan is the interest payment. Okay, the next indicator could be considered also a sort of success indicator, because this is on financial difficulties of students, and this is referring only to students where public support is a dominant income source. That means public support is providing more than 50% of students' total monthly income, including transfers in kind. So that means public support has really a crucial role for these students. And here you can see that in the group on the left-hand side, which is using the welfare principle, more than 1/3 of students in Poland, for which public support is the dominant source of income, report either serious or very serious financial difficulties. And in Lithuania, it's about a third of all students in this group. And in Switzerland, Germany, and Austria, it's about a quarter of students who report such financial difficulties. And the cross-country average is 29%. And in the second group, the degree of current financial difficulties is ranging from 35% in Norway to only 11% in Luxembourg. And on international average, it's only 23%. And now let's take a look at the last indicator. Now, this is about the social representation of certain social groups at higher education institutions. And EUROSTUDENT, as well as other international surveys, use an indicator to measure proportional social representation with workaround, I would say. The workaround is constructed in the way that we have two variables that we use to construct quotas. The first variable is the share of domestic students' fathers without tertiary degrees. That means we take a look at students' fathers and their highest educational attainment. And in this case, we focus on the group that where the students' fathers have not acquired tertiary education themselves. That means in terms of the ISCET classification, it encompasses ISCET 0 to 4. And this is compared to the share of men aged 40 to 59 years in the male population, also without tertiary education. And if we construct a ratio based on these two indicators, then the result is a quota, and this quota is used to measure proportional social representation. And if the quota of the two variables has the value 1, then it means the two shares have the same value, and the quota is 1. And the point for a country would be on the diagonal. So this diagonal can be viewed in formal terms as a perfect social representation of certain groups, in this case, the group without tertiary education at higher education institutions. If a country is below the diagonal, that means there's an underrepresentation of the social group in question. And if the point would be beyond the diagonal, then it means it's an overrepresentation of the social group. In this case, we see that all countries are below the diagonal. That means the social group without tertiary education is underrepresented at higher education institutions. And the country with the best performance is Malta with a value of 0.95. That means Malta is closest to a diagonal, and that means it's formally closest to perfect social representation. At the other end of the spectrum, it's Germany with a value of 0.46. That means Germany is farthest away from the diagonal. That means that the social representation of this social group is less than half, as it actually should be according to this indicator used here. And now it's quite difficult by sight to evaluate which country group is performing better, because there are many countries that are quite close to the diagonal. But if we take a look at the international averages again, then we see that the cross-country average for the group with welfare principle is 0.792. And the value for the group with the supply principle is 0.785. That means the group which is using the welfare principle, those with the blue, not points, but the blue countries shaped in blue are performing marginally better with respect to social representation. And that's actually a result which is a bit surprising at first sight, because the country group with the supply principle is actually using public support for a large group of the student population. And as we have seen before, on cross-country average, 67% of all students in these countries on average receive public support. And the public support in those countries on average accounts for more than half of the recipient's total monthly income. So that should actually foster access to higher education for low-income groups. But at least we don't see this in the data at hand. And this points to the fact that there may be other obstacles to entering higher education, also in the group that is applying the supply principle. Okay, to sum up the findings a little bit, we have seen that the European higher education area's preferred system for public student support is based actually on the supply principle. That is what I call the first preference. Public support that should be universally applicable to all students. And Based on the empirical analysis, we have seen that countries using the system require in comparison considerably greater demand on the public sector. That means the burden for the public sector is, at least in the short run, higher. We have seen that the share of recipients was more than 3 times as high compared to the group with the welfare principle, and also the income ratio. That means public support has share of the recipient's total monthly income was also higher, and at least in the short run, this places a higher burden, fiscal burden on the public sector in those countries. But at the same time, due to the structure of public support, that was a comparison of repayable and non-repayable support, we have seen that the share of loans is more than twice as high for the group with the supply principle. And that places a larger future financial burden on the students. We have also seen that under the supply principle, students have on average less often very serious financial difficulties. The country group with the supply principle performs marginally worse with respect to the participation of students without tertiary education background. And this was, at least at first sight, to me, a bit surprising. But we have to take into account that the difference between the two groups is marginal, and as we couldn't test for significance, that could be accidentally the result. Okay, that's actually so much from my side as far as the presentation is concerned. And I thank you for your patience and for paying attention. And I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I hope that you have some questions or comments to this analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christoph. Definitely very intriguing. So yeah, any questions, comments, please raise hands, let us know. And yeah, Aune has one question.
Thank you so much. I'm Aune from University of Tartu, Estonia. A very interesting talk. Especially, it's very relevant here in Estonia, where we are facing the discussions around this student support system changes. What I wanted to ask is the cost to the public budget. You said in the summary that the supply system is. I mean, you said something that it seems to be more costly, but you didn't analyze it in detail how it, because in supply system students pay some of the benefit back. So it's in the longer run, which system is more costly to the public budget?
Well, the result in the long run is difficult to answer. I can answer that not right away, but in the short run, as I try to explain, the supply or the public support system based on the supply system or supply principle is more costly in the short run because the public sector has to provide support for clearly a larger part of the student population, and also the share of public support and the recipient's income is higher compared to the other group. But as you said, and as I tried to indicate, in the long run, students have to repay large parts of the financial support that they received. For instance, a very prominent case is Norway, which is using 98% of public support as repayable support. And that, of course, places the burden of funding students on the students themselves. And the result in the long run, I can't answer that because that requires an analysis of its own. And I really don't know if there are any analysis around that could answer this question, but it would be worthwhile doing a research project on that.
Aune, you wanted to comment more?
Yeah, if not yet anybody else, then I have an additional question. I think it's, yeah, the simple question I would ask is what is the, I don't know, for example, a share of the GDP that goes to the student support system yearly? But I understand that you haven't analyzed that. But my other question, what you haven't analyzed, but I just wonder, would it be possible, and what would be the, I mean, theory or guess? Would be interesting to know, because whether the support system influences or it relates also to the student success. Let's say the success as a how many of them graduate and what is the dropout rate and so on. These kind of questions, because the thing what you analyzed was the equality, let's say, question: how many students without higher educated parents or fathers come to the higher education, but yeah, whether the support system influences the students' success in the higher education. That was not your question, I understand, but it's just a thing to discuss maybe about.
Well, your first question referring to the share of GDP dedicated to higher education. I can't answer that off the top of my head, but I know that, for instance, OECD Education at a Glance gives on annual basis the share of GDP that is dedicated to higher education. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, then the Scandinavian countries spend quite a high share of the GDP on higher education, and more than other countries. And as far as your second question is concerned, the success of students, I didn't take a look at that because the EUROSTUDENT data don't give information on student success. But from other international analysis, we know that the funding question is also important for student success, and that, for instance, students who are less successful during studies in academic terms, that means students who have worse grades than others, this problem is quite often found among students from low social backgrounds. And there is empirical evidence that, for instance, if students who have academic problems, for instance, students from low social backgrounds having academic problems, and if these students encounter also financial problems, then they are much more likely to drop out of higher education. So the financial problems aggravate other academic or even problems associated to socio-academic integration. So financial difficulties aggravate other problems these students have. And at least in that sense, financial support has an impact on the success of students. And of course, public support is to certain share of students a necessary financial condition for taking up studies. And in the absence of this support, many students wouldn't be able to attend higher education institutions. So that's definitely a success factor for students. And yeah, maybe that's already a partial answer to your question.
Any other questions or comments? Feel free. Yes, Helga?
Thank you. I have a question regarding whether you looked at the systems, if you take out a grant or if you get study support. This in Austria, at least, it's also connected to your study success. So you don't, in the second year of your studies, if you don't prove that you succeeded in your studies to a certain extent of ECTS, which you have, then you won't get any support anymore. Is that the case in all the countries you looked at?
I know that this is also the case in Germany. So our students who receive BAföG, public support, need to show proof of performance, so that they are progressing in their studies. And if there's not sufficient progress, then they might lose public support. I guess I try to recall a study that I looked at quite some time ago. I think this is a criteria in many countries, at least in the countries applying the welfare principle. And I can imagine that things are a bit different, for instance, in the Scandinavian countries that are applying the supply principle. But maybe someone from a Scandinavian country can help me with that. I can see that someone from Denmark is present, but I don't want to expose you to the public, just in case you don't want to answer.
Hello, Christoph. Yes.
Hi, Amanda.
Hello. Yeah, I should just said that in Denmark, you're able to get the student support or the student supply if you are a full-time student. And that actually means that you have to study and you have to be an active student to get it. But you might be able, in some case, if you need, if you need to take like not a long break, but a short break, because there might be some circumstances where you need a break, and that could also be if you maybe have a disability or something. I'm not that into it because that's not my specific area. But well, of course, you need to be a full-time student and you need to be active to get the support. So we will register if you have decided to drop out, then you're not able to get any student support before you will start again. That is actually what I remember at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much, Amanda.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, please, Robert.
Hi, thank you for the talk, Christoph.
Hi, Robert.
We had you here in Vienna last month, but that was not possible. I was wondering, while we are talking about the details of the supports in the different countries, did you have a look into the amount of money that is handed out? And I mean, you had the share of the monthly budget, so to say, but I was also wondering about the absolute amount, or if there's any link to the, I don't know, average living costs, for instance.
Yes, let me go back to the presentation. Just a second. Because I took a look at the level of student income. This is sort of complementing the analysis on students' financial difficulties. I took a look at students who receive public support, and where public support is the dominant source of income, meaning that it provides more than half of students' total monthly income. And we can see that in the group with the welfare principle, the total student income on average is higher compared to the group with the supply principle. And that was kind of a surprise to me, because I thought the fact that the group with the supply principle reports less financial difficulties might be also due to the fact that students under those systems receiving public support would receive, would receive higher amounts, but compared to the other group of countries, but that is obviously not the case. But with respect to the financial difficulties, I must admit that's only one side of the coin, because financial difficulties are always the result of the interplay of income and expenses. And I didn't take a look at the expense side of those students, because that indeed would only make sense with the microdata, because you know that income and expenses are variables where we could have missings, and therefore it doesn't make sense to oppose student income and expenditure directly with the aggregate data. For this, we would need the microdata, and therefore I just took a look at the revenue side of the students, and I was a bit surprised that under the welfare principle, the average income was clearly higher than compared to the other country group.
Thank you.
Anyone else? If not, I actually have one question myself too that I started thinking about. And I was wondering, do you know if there are any countries that have changed the principle, the main principle that they follow in their public support system? And what do you think, or how do you feel, how difficult it is actually to change the system once it's ready? Or what would you say? Is it very much somehow influenced by a path dependency, that you have already created a system followed by one principle, and it's actually very difficult to change it then? How do you feel?
Well, over time, there are always reforms of public student support systems, whether we take a look at Germany or the Czech Republic, I think Estonia, Poland. In the recent past, they all experienced more or less great reforms of public student support systems. But in my view, there seems not to be a radical system change. At least I can't remember from the literature I've seen that there was a radical change in the public student support system. For instance, in Germany, if I take a look at my own country's history, there have been several major reforms of the BAföG. For instance, in the beginning, when BAföG was introduced, it used to be a full grant. And sometime later on, a part of the support was changed into a loan. And in the 1980s, the system changed to a complete loan. And in the 1990s, we did change to the current system, which uses 50% as a loan and 50% as a grant. So you always have some variables that are reformed, for instance, the composition of public support in terms of grants and loans. Or for instance, there may be changes in the interest rate. If loans are given out to students interest bearing, then you would see that during the course of time, the interest rate might change. Sometimes reforms are greater, sometimes they are smaller. But I think a radical reform is very seldom. And I think there is something like a path dependency. Once you have installed a certain system, then you stick to the system. And I think maybe, I don't know, I don't want to put our own Ministry of Education and Research under pressure. But in Germany, we have currently a heated debate about the BAföG, and the Ministry for Education and Research is actually thinking about a major reform of the BAföG. And in some interviews, also the expression system change was mentioned. At the moment, I doubt that we will see a radical change, so that we change from the welfare principle to the supply principle. Because I remember long time ago, I spoke to a lawyer at a conference, and the conference was dealing with possible reforms of the student support system. And this lawyer said, well, if we want to change to a system that is based on the supply principle, then this requires a major reform of our maintenance law. And that will be a hell of a work, and it would be a complete nightmare. And to my opinion, this person said, this is not going to happen. I don't know if that is true. Maybe in the future we will see a major reform. I don't know, but I'll keep an eye on that.
Thank you very much, Christoph. And Aune, you wanted to comment or ask?
Yeah, I actually just wanted to comment the two last questions or comments. It's for your Marlene, for your comment. I think it's quite clear that the student support system is not the standalone system. It's related to the other support systems in the country and the tax system, and the understanding what is the roles of parents and family as such. And so it's not a system in itself. But for Robert's question, I just wanted to clarify to be sure that I understand correctly the figure. Was the numbers that you showed, the support amount numbers, whether you average public support for the students who get the support, whether the average income numbers of all students, or what were the numbers showing exactly?
No, that was only the median income of those students who do receive national public student support.
Mm-hmm. And that was only total income, not just the public income?
That was the total median income in terms of public support and own earnings and family support and other support. Yeah, it's the median of the total income.
And I'm just mentioning that Amanda also puts a link about the Danish student education grant system to the chat. So if anybody is interested, then it's there. Anyways, any other questions or comments, or we should wrap it up soon as well? If not, then thank you, Christoph, for your very intriguing presentation. And
my pleasure.
Thanks for all the listeners who came and listened and were actually participating. We're very grateful. And I shouldn't forget, and I really have to mention that please, if you have time, please also fill in the feedback form. I also once again posted it in the chat. And also I can already say that you can save the date for the next EUROSTUDENT Talks. It's the 24th of November. And we are talking about financial situation and mental health of students during the COVID-19 pandemic. So also very timely, I would say. But yes, thank you, Christoph, once again. And thanks for all the other listeners. And see you next time, I think.
Thank you, Marlene, and thanks to the audience and you for your activeness. And yeah, thank you for the chance for this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. And if possible, Christoph, can you stay for a second?
Yes,
Yeah.
I will.
Bye-bye, everyone, and thank you.
Goodbye.